A Lakota chief's sister was hours from death, and the woman who saved her was white. My sister's name was Kapalooda, Red Beaver. She'd had that name since she was 3 years old because she walked into the creek behind our mother's lodge and sat down in it and refused to come out. Just sat there in the cold current staring at a beaver dam like she was negotiating something. My mother had to wade in after her. She came out laughing. Kapalooda came out serious, which she stayed for the rest of her life. She was the better of the two of us. I want to say that plainly. This was 1887. The agency was a day's ride south of the Black Hills, which by then were no longer ours, a fact I had learned to carry the way you carry a stone in your boot, always there, reshaping how you walk. I was 38 years old. I had been head man of our band for 6 years, since our father died of a fever that the agency doctor decided was not worth treating. The doctor's name was Alderman. He is not in this story except as a shape, the shape of a man who looks at you and sees something less than what you are, and acts accordingly and sleeps fine. Kapalooda had 2 children, a husband named Runs Ahead who was a good man and a poor rider, and a laugh that started slow and then took over her whole face. She was 34. She had survived the move to the agency, survived the winter of '81 when we lost 11 people in 8 days, survived the thing they did to the language at the school. She survived things I won't list because the list is long and familiar, and you already know the shape of it. She did not survive the birth of her 3rd child. Not entirely, not without, but I am getting ahead of myself. That is what fear does, makes you run at the ending before you've earned it. It started on a Thursday in late October. I know it was Thursday because the supply wagon came on Thursdays, and I had been down at the road waiting for it, watching the driver. A man named Pickett who always looked like he was chewing something he didn't like, unload flour that was half weevil and salt pork that had been salted and resalted until it tasted like the idea of meat rather than meat itself. I was watching that and keeping my face still and my mouth shut because I had learned by then that a still face and a shut mouth got more done than anything else I might try. I got back to camp, and Runs Ahead was standing outside the lodge with his hands open at his sides, which is not how a man stands when things are fine. The baby had come early, 3 weeks, maybe 4. It had come fast and wrong, turned, the women said, turned and stuck, and Kapalooda had been laboring since before first light, and it was now past midday and the baby had not come and she had stopped making sound, which was worse than if she'd been screaming. I went in. I will not describe what I saw in full, except to say that my sister's face was the color of birch bark and her breathing was shallow and fast, and there was a smell in that lodge that I recognized. I had smelled it before, in the winter of '81, on the people we lost. The body working past what it can work past. Our medicine woman, Stan's looking, was with her. She had done everything she knew. She said it quietly without shame because there is no shame in knowing the edge of what you know. She said, "There is a woman." At the Callahan place 12 miles north, a white woman, a widow, they say she has done this before, turned babies, saved women the doctors had given up on. I said, "What doctors?" She said, "The ones at the fort." I said, "Alderman." She didn't answer, she didn't need to. I was on a horse in 4 minutes. 12 miles north on an October afternoon is not a comfortable ride. The wind was out of the northwest and it had teeth. The grass had gone yellow-gray and it pressed flat under the gusts like it was trying to make itself small. I rode hard enough that the cold stopped mattering, which is its own kind of blessing. The Callahan place was a homestead, a low house, stone foundation, 1 outbuilding, a kitchen garden gone to seed for the season, a milk cow in the yard. Smoke from the chimney, which meant someone was home, which meant I had ridden 12 miles for something. I knocked. The woman who opened the door was not what I expected, though I'll admit I hadn't spent much of those 12 miles deciding what to expect. She was maybe 30, maybe a few years either side. Medium height. Brown hair pulled back hard. She had flour on one sleeve and she was holding a wooden spoon, and she looked at me the way people sometimes look at something unexpected, not afraid, not welcoming, just taking it in. I said, "My sister is dying." She said, "How far?" I said, 12 miles south. She said, "Turn baby." I said, "They think so." She didn't say anything else. She went back inside. I heard her moving, heard something set down on a table, heard the sound of a bag being pulled from somewhere. She came back out wearing a coat and carrying a satchel, and she walked to the outbuilding without explaining herself. 2 minutes later she came out leading a mare, already bridled. I did not say thank you then. There wasn't time and she wasn't waiting for it. We rode. Her name was Eliza Marsh. She told me that about halfway back, not as introduction, more like she was completing a sentence she'd started in her head. She said, "I'm Eliza Marsh." I said I was called Tashunka Waist. Good horse. She said it back, Tashunka Waist, got the sounds close enough that I knew she was someone who listened carefully. She asked me questions as we rode. How long had my sister been in labor? What had the women observed about the baby's position? Whether there was bleeding and how much? I answered everything. She listened with her whole body, the way some people do, not just with their ears but leaning slightly forward, like the information mattered enough to move toward. I had dealt with white people for 20 years. Agency officials, soldiers, traders, missionaries, the Dr. Alderman. I knew how most of them listened. They listened the way you listen to wind, taking in enough to know which direction it was coming from, then discarding the rest. This woman listened differently. That was the first thing I noticed. I filed it away and kept riding. We got back to camp as the light was going blue-gray. Runs Ahead was still outside. He looked at me, then at her, and something moved across his face, relief, I think, but the fragile kind, the kind that knows it might be too early. Eliza Marsh went into the lodge and I did not follow her in. There are things that are not my place, and that was one of them. I stood outside with Runs Ahead and we did not talk much. He was not a man for unnecessary speech, and neither, generally, am I. We stood in the cold and listened, and the camp went quiet around us. Not the normal quiet of evening, but the particular quiet of people holding still because something important is happening nearby. After a long time, I don't know how long, time does strange things when you're waiting on something like that. There was a sound from inside the lodge that was not my sister's breathing or the fire or the wind. It was a baby. Small and furious and absolutely certain of itself. Runs Ahead made a sound I will not try to describe. I put my hand on his shoulder and kept it there until he steadied. Eliza Marsh came out an hour later. She was tired in the clean way of someone who has worked very hard at something that mattered. She had washed her hands. She was carrying her satchel and she stood in the entrance of the lodge and she said, "Your sister is going to be all right. The baby is small but she's breathing well. Keep them warm. Don't move them for at least 3 days." I said, "What can I give you?" She said, "Nothing." I said, "That is not acceptable." She looked at me for a moment. Then she almost smiled, not a full smile, something at the edge of one. She said, "I didn't come for payment." I said, "Then why did you come?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because you asked." I thought about that on the ride back. I rode with her all the way to the Callahan place because it was full dark by then and the road between was not safe for a woman alone. There were men who used the darkness as permission, and I knew which ones they were. She didn't argue about being escorted. She rode and I rode and we didn't say much. And when we got to her door she said good night and went inside, and I sat on my horse for a moment in front of that dark house with the lamplight showing under the door, and I thought, that is a particular kind of person. The kind that is rarer than gold and less visible. Her husband had been dead 2 years. He'd come west to homestead and the West had disagreed with him. A horse fall, a bad ankle, gangrene by the time anyone understood what was happening. She had stayed. People asked her why, and she said because the land was paid for, which was true but not complete. I learned this over the following weeks, which I had not expected. She came back 3 times to check on Kapaluda and the baby, who was named Ampo Dawn because of what time she'd finally arrived. Each time, she rode the 12 miles herself. Each time, I rode out to meet her at the road, which became a habit so quickly that I stopped noticing it was a habit. The 3rd visit, she stayed to eat. Kapaluda insisted. My sister had been watching Eliza Marsh with the same careful attention she'd given that beaver dam at age 3, serious, thoughtful, negotiating something in her own head. She made her stay for the meal, and Eliza did not argue, and they sat and talked haltingly, Eliza's Lakota being limited and Kapaluda's English being better than she usually let on, and somehow they understood each other well enough. After walking her back to her horse, Kapaluda said to me in Lakota, "She is lonely." I said, "Most people out here are lonely." She said, "Yes, but she carries it like it's her own fault." There were men at the agency who did not want Eliza Marsh near our camp. This was not entirely surprising. There is a kind of man who believes that a white woman choosing to help the wrong people is a personal insult to him, as though her goodwill is a finite thing, and every bit she extends to us is stolen from him. The man who felt this most loudly was named Cutter. He ran one of the trading posts, and he had an arrangement with aldermen that I will not describe in detail, except to say it involved whiskey and debt, and the particular way that small corrupt men build small corrupt systems and then defend them with enormous energy. Eliza Marsh had, at some point before I met her, refused to purchase supplies from Cutter's post. She'd ridden the extra distance to the settlement at Warfield instead. He had not forgotten this. Men like Cutter have long memories for slights and short ones for their own conduct. In November, he came to see me. He came to the edge of our camp with 2 other men. One of them worked for him. One of them was simply the kind of man who attaches himself to louder men for warmth. He stood at the edge and called for me, and I came out and looked at him. He said, "I hear you've been running that Marsh widow out here regular." I said, "She comes to check on a patient." He said, "I hear it's more than that." I looked at him. I have a way of looking at people that my father taught me, not aggressive, not flinching, just level, the way a mountain looks at weather. Cutter didn't like it. Most men like Cutter don't. They want either fear or anger from you, and if you give them neither, they don't know which pocket to reach into. He said, "She doesn't need to be riding into Indian camps. People talk." I said, "Let them." He said some other things after that, louder things, things meant to make me angry or afraid. I let them go past. Eventually, he ran out of words and left, which is what happens when you don't give a man the argument he came for. But I knew it wasn't finished. I went to see Eliza Marsh the next day. She was mending fence on the east side of her property, which told me she was the kind of woman who did not wait for problems to become large before she addressed them. She had a hammer and a bucket of staples, and she was working with the economical movements of someone who has done a thing many times. I rode up and she looked at me and she said, "You didn't have to ride all the way out here." I said, "Cutter came to the camp yesterday." She stopped working. She looked at me steadily. She said, "What did he say?" I told her. She listened. When I was finished, she turned back to the fence and drove in a staple with 3 precise strokes. She said, "I know what he is." I said, "He'll make it difficult for you." She said, "He's been making it difficult for me for 2 years. She paused. She said, "What exactly are you worried about?" That stopped me. I had ridden out here thinking I was bringing her a warning. She was asking me what, specifically, I was afraid would happen. It was a reasonable question. It reorganized the conversation. I said, "You're a woman alone out here." She said, "I know that." I said, "He has friends." She said, "So do I." She said it simply, not as a challenge, not as bravado, matter of fact. and she glanced at me when she said it just briefly and then looked back at the fence. I stayed and helped her finish the fence line. We worked on opposite sides, me pulling wire taut while she stapled. It was the kind of work that doesn't require talking, and so we didn't talk much, and that was fine. The wind had laid down and the afternoon was cold but clear, the sky that particular blue that comes in November out here like an apology for everything else. When we were done, she invited me in for coffee. I went in. Her house was spare and clean, and had the feeling of a place that had been arranged by someone paying close attention to what they actually needed and not much else. A good stove, a table with 2 chairs, books more than I'd expected. A cabinet of medical supplies organized with a precision that told me this was the center of things for her, the part that mattered most. She made coffee. I sat at the table and looked at the books, and she asked me which ones I had read, and I told her, and she was not surprised, which I noticed. Some people are surprised when I know things. She was not that kind of person. We talked for 2 hours. I don't know that I have ever talked to a white person for 2 hours and come away feeling that the conversation had gone where it wanted to go, unsteered by what either of us was supposed to be. But that's how it was. We talked about the agency and what it was doing and what I thought should be done, and she listened and pushed back sometimes and was wrong about a few things and right about others. We talked about medicine. She'd learned from a physician in Missouri before she came west, a man who taught her the things he knew and told her she had a better instinct for it than most people he'd trained formally. We talked about the Black Hills. She knew enough about what had happened there to be quiet about it in the right places, which is a form of respect. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the door. She said, "If Cutter comes back, will you tell me?" I said, "If he does anything worth telling." She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I can handle Cutter." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I don't doubt that. I just want to know what's happening if it involves me." I said I would tell her. I rode home. The moon was up by then, 3/4 full, and it threw enough light to ride by, and the prairie was silver and black and absolutely still, and I will tell you something about that ride. I was aware of something I had not been aware of in a long time, which was that the particular silence of riding home alone felt like something that could, possibly, be different. Not a thought I pushed at. Just something that was there, the way the moon was there. You don't argue with the moon. Cutter did not take long. 3 days later, he went to the agency and told the subagent, a small, anxious man named Trout who wanted very much to please everyone, and therefore pleased no one, that Eliza Marsh was interfering with agency operations by providing medical treatment to reservation residents without authorization. He said she was encouraging dependency. He said she was a disruption to the proper order of things. Trout came to me. He always came to me as though I were a problem to be managed by inclusion. He told me there had been a complaint. He said the widow Marsh should perhaps direct her charitable impulses toward more appropriate channels. I asked him, "Is she authorized to provide medical services to white settlers in the area?" He said, "Well, there's no formal prohibition." I said, "Is she being paid by anyone for what she does here?" He said, "I believe not." I said, "Then what exactly is the complaint?" Trout blinked several times and rearranged his expression, and said there had been concerns raised, and he was simply passing them along, and he hoped I understood his position. I said I understood his position perfectly. After he left, I went to find Cutter. I found him at his trading post, behind his counter, looking at me with the careful expression of a man who expected this and was not entirely sure what to do with it. His employee was somewhere in the back. I could hear him moving around. I said, "Leave her alone." Cutter said, "I don't know what you think." I said, "You went to Trout. That was a mistake. If you go to anyone else about Eliza Marsh, the agency, the fort, anyone, I will personally make it my business to explain to every family on this reservation exactly what is in the flour you sell and why it costs what it costs, and what your arrangement with aldermen looks like in detail. I have been keeping notes for 2 years. I had been keeping notes for 2 years. I'm careful that way. Cutter stared at me. The man in the back had gone very quiet. I said, she rides where she wants. She helps who she helps. And if anyone touches her or makes it uncomfortable for her to do her work, those notes stop being just notes. I turned and walked out. I don't know that I have ever felt quite so much like my father as I did walking out of that trading post in the thin November sun. My father had been a man who spoke plainly and moved quietly and did not threat unless he intended to follow through, which meant he almost never had to follow through. I had learned this from watching him. The weight of what you're willing to do is the same whether you do it or not. The other man can feel it. I told Eliza what I'd done when I saw her the following week. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know." She said, "Those notes, are they real?" I said, "Every word." She looked at me. There was something in her expression that I didn't immediately have a name for, not gratitude exactly, though that was in there. Something more considered than gratitude. The way a person looks when they are revising what they thought they knew about a situation. She said, "Why?" I said, "Why what?" She said, "Why does it matter to you what happens to me?" This was a fair question. I thought about how to answer it honestly. I said, "Because you came when I asked. Because you didn't make it about what you were supposed to do or who I was or what it would look like. You just came. That is not a common thing. I don't care to see uncommon things get discouraged." She was quiet. The fire was going in the stove, and the afternoon light was coming through the one west window, and it lay across the table between us. She said, "I have not had anyone." She stopped. She started again. She said, "Since Thomas died I have been." She looked at the window. She said, "People are kind, mostly, but kind in the way of people who have decided what my situation is and feel sorry about it. You never did that, from the first night." I said, "I didn't have time to feel sorry for your situation." She almost laughed, not quite, something close to it. She said, "No, you didn't." I said, "Do you want me to?" She said, "No." I said, "Good." The fire settled in the stove. Outside, her milk cow made a sound and then stopped. I came back a week later with 2 men from our camp to mend the section of her roof that was letting in cold air. She stood outside and watched for a moment and then went inside and made something, biscuits, I think, from the smell. And when we came down, she brought them out and I sat on the porch steps in the cold afternoon and ate a biscuit, and she sat down beside me. She was close enough that I could see the particular way she held herself, not tense, but contained, the way of someone who has learned to take up a considered amount of space. She had flour on her sleeve again, the same sleeve as the first time. She said, "This is going to keep happening, isn't it? People like Cutter." I said, "Yes." She said, "You can't keep stepping in front of everything." I said, "I don't intend to step in front of everything, just the things in my way." She looked at me. She said, "Am I in your way?" I said, "You're about as far from in my way as a person can get." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Tashunka waste." She said it carefully, the way she always said it. She said, "I've been thinking about something and I want to say it plainly, and if I'm wrong about something you should tell me." I said, "All right." She said, "I don't want to be a person who came out here and tried to do some good and then was outlasted by the Cutters of the world. I want to stay. I want to keep doing what I do, and I think." She paused. She looked at the middle distance, which is where she looked when she was being careful. She said, "I think I could do it better if I wasn't alone. Not." She stopped again. She said, "I'm not asking you for something you haven't offered. I'm telling you what I think is true, and I think you can decide what to do with it." The afternoon was still. There was a thin line of cloud to the west, going pink at the edges. My 2 men had ridden back to camp, and it was just the two of us on that porch with the biscuits and the cold air and the milk cow standing in the yard like it was waiting for something. I said, "I think you are right about what is true." She said, "All right." I said, "And I think you already know what I'll decide." She looked at me then, straight at me, the way she'd looked at me from the first moment, not afraid, not performing anything, just taking it in. But there was something different now, something that had not been there at the beginning, something warm and particular and entirely not performed. And she leaned slightly toward me, not much, just a small adjustment of her weight, her shoulder finding mine, and she stayed there. I didn't move. Neither did she. The cloud in the west went from pink to red. My shoulder felt the weight and warmth of hers, and I thought, this is what my sister meant about loneliness and fault. She carries it like it's her own fault. And maybe she had, up until something made it clear it didn't have to be. I hoped I was that. I had the feeling I was. Cutter did not go to the agency again. He kept his flower arrangements to himself. Alderman kept his distance. Trout continued to blink at problems and pass them along and be ignored by everyone, including himself. Eliza Marsh kept coming to the camp. She delivered 2 more children that winter, one of them in a blizzard that should have been impossible, and after that there were people in our camp who would have argued the case for her to almost anyone. She learned more Lakota. She taught Cowboy, who was fully recovered and whose daughter Ampo was thriving, a card game that Cowboy proceeded to win repeatedly and with great satisfaction. In the spring she moved, not far, a few miles, to land adjacent to ours, land she had been quietly paying into for the previous months without telling me, which I found out about in the way you find out about things a careful person has arranged, all at once, when they decide it's time. I asked her why adjacent. She said, because 12 miles is far and I am tired of the 12 miles. I said, you could come closer. She said I could. I said, is there a reason you haven't? She looked at me in that way she had. She said, I was waiting to be asked. I asked. What I want you to understand is this. For 6 years, I had been the man standing between my people and a series of things that wanted to take more from us. It was the right work and I would do it again. But it is a particular kind of wearing, being the one who is always braced, always reading the edge of what's coming, always with your hands up and your face level and your notes in order. She did not take that from me. I want to be clear about that. I am still that man. But there is a difference between carrying a stone and carrying a stone, while someone walks beside you who knows you're carrying it and does not make you pretend otherwise. She never asked me to pretend. She didn't need the version of me that was easier to look at. She wanted the actual thing, the weight and the work of it, and the particular silence of a man who has been standing his ground for years and knows how to keep standing it. The first morning she woke in our camp, early before anyone else, I was already outside. She came and stood beside me. The sun was just edging up over the hills to the east, and the camp was still, and the prairie was still, and she put her hand in the crook of my arm and stood there looking at the same thing I was looking at. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. We watched the sun come all the way up. Cowboy named her daughter after the dawn, and there we were, standing in it, and I will tell you this. A man can carry a great deal if he knows at the end of the day there is someone who looks at him, not at what he represents or what he stands for, but at him, the actual man, the particular man, and has decided that is exactly where she wants to be. That is the whole of it. The sun came up. We watched it.